They are a people often in conflict with the men of Rohan, and while they would later come into the service of Saruman, their origins and their history was not that of clear-cut villains, but rather a group friended, then wronged by the men of Numenor. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the Dunlendings. As one might expect, the name Dunlendings derives from the location they are most associated with, the lands of Dunland, which lie to the northwest of Isengard. However, the Dunlendings, like all men, would originate in the far east of Middle-earth. These ancient men were divided into 3 clans under their respective leaders: the Beorians, the Hadorians, and the Halidin. As we covered in my video on the Edain, many would cross the Blue Mountains into Beleriand. However, there were also men who would remain behind. These would come to be known by the later Numenoreans as middlemen. Some of the Hadorians would settle in the Vales of Anduin and Rhovanion, becoming the ancestors of the Rohirrim. Meanwhile, some of the Halidin would settle in Eriador, becoming the ancestors of the Dunlendings. While it is said the Beorians and Hadorians spoke a common language and traveled together for much of their migration, the Halidin are described as reclusive, a trait we will see continue through generations. These Dunlending ancestors would settle in the lands on either side of the Gwathlo River, in regions known as Meniriath and Enedwaith. Several hundred years later, these men of Middle-earth would learn of other men sailing from the Western Sea to visit the elves of Lindon. Despite being on the eastern side of the Blue Mountains during the First Age, they had heard rumors of a terrible war beyond the Western Mountains, and the resulting destruction of Beleriand. For well over 600 years, these middlemen would assume that all men dwelling in Beleriand at the time of the War of Wrath were destroyed. But it had also been passed down generation to generation that the men of Beleriand had once been kinsmen of their own. Thus, these men would send word to High King Gil-galad, asking if they could meet these shipmen, who had returned from death in the depths of the sea. A group of 12 of the greatest of these men would travel to the Tower Hills, where they would meet for the first time the men of Numenor. Despite many others fearing the Numenoreans would be spirits of the dead, these 12 would have no doubt of their shared ancestry, though the Numenoreans looked more like elvish lords than mortal men. It is said that likewise the Numenoreans looked with glad surprise on the men of Middle-earth, for they believed the men who stayed behind in Eriador would have fallen under the sway of evil, for Morgoth in the last days of the First Age had summoned evil men from the east. While their languages are quite different, they soon discovered many common words and were able to converse about simple matters quite quickly. The Numenoreans would teach many things to these men of Middle-earth, commonly known as pre-Numenoreans. They would teach not only the ancestors of the Dunlendings, but many men up and down the coasts of Middle-earth. They taught them language, brought corn and wine, and instructed them in sowing of seed, grinding of grain, hewing of wood, and shaping of stone. It is said, then the men of Middle-earth were comforted, and here and there upon the western shores the houseless woods drew back, and men shook off the yoke of the offspring of Morgoth, and unlearned their terror of the dark. And they revered the memory of the tall sea kings, and when they had departed they called them gods, hoping for their return. Yet this relationship would sour. As the felling of trees in Numenor causes strife, Aldarion establishes the port of Londair at the mouth of the Gwathlo, where he can manage timber and build ships. As the Numenorean tree felling reaches devastating levels, the middlemen begin attacking and ambushing their former allies. In return, the Numenoreans treat them as enemies, becoming ruthless in their felling of trees and giving no thought to husbandry or replanting. The surviving men of this devastation from Enedwaith would take refuge west of the Misty Mountains, the lands that would come to be known as Dunland. Some of these men would move further north until reaching what would later become Bree-land, becoming the ancestors of the men of Bree, like Barlam and Butterbur. Due to the Numenoreans and their actions, the Dunlendings would be bitter enemies of the men of the West and their allies for thousands of years. When it comes to the deforestation of the Numenoreans, Tolkien says, "The devastation wrought by the Numenoreans was incalculable. For long years these lands were their chief source of timber, not only for their shipyards at Londire and elsewhere, but also for Numenor itself. Shiploads innumerable passed west over the sea." After the fall of their island kingdom, the Numenoreans would establish the realms of Gondor in the south and Arnor in the north. Yet the hostility of the Dunlendings would keep them from inhabiting the lands of Enedwaith. Over time, some middlemen, or pre-Numenoreans, would come to intermingle and become part of the Dunedain and their realms. Not so with the Dunlendings. Yet while they would hold their hatred of the Numenoreans, they were not so isolated as to not live in peace with other peoples or even races. During the wandering days of the hobbits, somewhere around 1150 of the Third Age, some of the Stoor hobbits would come to live alongside the men of Dunland. Many Stoors would dwell in these lands over the next 450 years, until shortly after the Shire is founded in 1601. Just 35 years later, the Great Plague would ravage much of Gondor and Rhovanion. Thanks to their tendency to isolate, the Dunlendings are impacted less than much of Middle-earth. Between this plague and centuries of conflict with the Easterlings, the Gondorian population of Calenarthon dwindles. During this time, Gondor ceases to man their garrisons in the north, and the Dunlendings begin to settle in portions of Calenarthon. One such area is the Gondorian fortress of Angrenost, more commonly known as Isengard. This is one of the few locations where a Gondorian garrison remained, though the Dunlendings would mingle with these Gondorians, and eventually the line of the chieftains here would fail. Yet the Dunlending settlement of Calenarthon would not last, and would be a point of contention for centuries to come. In 2510, Steward Cirion of Gondor awards the Eotheod of Rhovanion with all the lands of Calenarthon, in thanks for their aid during a particularly dire conflict with the Easterlings. The Dunlendings view these new people as competitors and usurpers. Thus, their animosity toward the new kingdom of Rohan is born. Often over the coming centuries, the Dunlendings would attack the Rohirrim when they were weak. While Calenarthon is lost to them, their mingling with the people of Isengard allows them to settle around the fortress of Orthanc, though they do not gain access to the fortress itself. In time, the Dunlendings themselves would take control of the Ring of Isengard, and kill any of the Gondorian guards unwilling to join their people. During the reigns of King Brego and his son Aldor, the Rohirrim would drive the Dunlendings out of Rohan, and they are forced beyond the Isen River. Incidentally, it is likely these very events that Saruman is referring to in the Two Towers film, as he riles up the men who swear fealty to him, declaring, "The horsemen took your lands." However, sometime after Aldor's death in 2645, the Dunlendings would cross into Rohan and settle in the northern Westfold, the mountain glens around the Ring of Isengard, and the southern eaves of Fangorn Forest. Once again, they would be openly hostile against the Rohirrim. However, there were instances of Rohirrim and Dunlendings living peacefully in these days. And while it was rare, there were some among the Rohirrim who were descended from both Dunland and Rohan. One such person is Freka, a lord of Rohan whose lands were on both sides of the Adorn River, west of the Gap of Rohan. As a lord of Rohan, Freka would gain both wealth and power. and while he was often summoned to King Helm's councils, he would attend only when he saw fit. It was to one of these councils in 2754 where Freka would come with many of his men and ask for the hand of Helm's daughter for his son Wolf. The king, who mistrusted Freka, would reply, "You have grown big since you were last here, but it is mostly fat, I guess." And men laughed at that, for Freka was wide in the belt. Then Freka fell in a rage and reviled the king, and said this at the last, "Old kings that refuse a proffered staff may fall on their knees." After their council, Helm would order Freka outside where they could settle their dispute. In Helm's declaration to Freka, we find that animosity toward the Dunlendings is still very strong in Rohan. "Now, Dunlending," said the king, "you have only Helm to deal with, alone and unarmed. But you have said much already, and it is my turn to speak. Freka, your folly has grown with your belly. You talk of a staff. If Helm dislikes a crooked staff that is thrust upon him, he breaks it. So!" With that, he smote Freka such a blow with his fist that he fell back stunned, and died soon after. Helm then proclaimed Freka's son and near kin the king's enemies, and they fled, for at once Helm sent many men riding to the west marches. 4 years later, in 2758, Rohan is invaded from the east. Seeing their chance, the Dunlendings, now led by Wolf, come over the Isen and down from Isengard. The Dunlendings are bolstered by a group of corsairs who had attacked up the Gondorian coast and landed in the mouths of the Lefnui and Isen. The Dunlendings would meet Helm and his forces at the crossings of Isen and defeat the king, driving him back to the Hornburg. With the king under siege in the fortress that would later be known as Helm's Deep, Wolf captures Edoras. Helm's son Haleth would die defending the doors of Meduseld, and Wolf would take the throne, calling himself king. The siege of the Hornburg, at this time called the Soothburg, combined with the sack of Edoras, would arguably be the greatest conquest in Dunlending history. Over the coming 5 months, Rohan would lie under snow during the long winter. The siege of the Burg would go on, and the Dunlendings would claim the life of Helm's second son, Hama, during a skirmish. In his grief, and in the midst of famine, Helm would go out at night, clad in white, stalking into the Dunlending camps, and kill men with his bare hands. In the end, Helm would be discovered one morning frozen as he stood. Long would the legend of Helm strike fear into the hearts of the Dunlendings. Shortly after the winter breaks, in March of 2759, Helm's nephew Freyolf leads Rohirrim survivors from Dunharrow to Edoras. Their attack takes Wolf and his people by surprise, and Freyolf kills the self-proclaimed king in the very hall of Meduseld. Finally, the Gondorians, having overcome their own battles, would assist the Rohirrim in driving out the remaining Dunlendings. By the end of that very year, the Dunlendings would be fully driven out of Rohan, including Isengard, which they had long held. In their place would come an unexpected occupant and supposed ally of Gondor and Rohan, the wizard Saruman the White. Because of this invasion of the Dunlendings, the Rohirrim enthusiastically welcomed the wizard to their northern border. Little did they realize that centuries later this wizard would turn on them and enlist the aid of the Dunlendings. We are told the Dunlendings would again occupy some of the West March until the reign of King Folkwyne, who, with the help of Gondor, would reconquer the lands. Nearly 200 years later, Saruman would enlist the Dunlendings to raid the cities and settlements of Rohan. With Saruman's machinations through Wormtongue, the Rohirrim soldiers are undermined, and the Dunlendings meet little resistance in their attacks. Not only would Saruman use these men as soldiers against Rohan, but also as spies in the north. One such spy is known only as the Squint-Eyed Southerner. This man is revealed to be an exile from Dunland, cast out by his people due to the rumor he had orcish blood, possibly indicating he was a half-orc or goblin man, terrible creatures made by the work of Saruman himself. Regardless of his ancestry, he would enter the service of Saruman and originally be stationed on the borders of the Shire, negotiating the purchase of supplies, including the pipeweed Merry and Pippin would later discover at Orthanc. Along with managing trade, the Southerner was to spy on the Shire and learn of any hobbits leaving its borders, all in hopes of finding the bearer of the One Ring. However, this Dunlending exile would change allegiances. One day, as the Nazgul make their way toward the Shire, they discover the Southerner at the crossing of Tharbad. The Witch King puts the shadow of fear upon the Dunlending, and he would no longer serve Saruman, but Sauron. The Southerner meets with another servant of the Nazgul, Bill Ferny, at the Prancing Pony Inn on September 29, 3018. Together, they would witness Frodo Baggins disappear, an event they would report to the Nazgul. The next morning, after the Nazgul attack on the Prancing Pony, Frodo would catch a glimpse of the Southerner in the window of Bill Ferny's house. Now, over the years, many fans have wondered about his description as squint-eyed, a topic Christopher himself addressed. Just what my father meant to convey by the squint-eyed Southerner at Bree, I'm not sure. I don't think that he can possibly have meant that the man had slit eyes, goblin-like. He may have meant that he actually had a squint, optical disorder, but that seems unnecessarily particular. So the likeliest meaning, I think, is that the man didn't look straight, but obliquely, watchfully, sideways, suggesting craftiness and crookedness. While we know nothing else of this particular character, the Dunlendings would again play a large role in Saruman's plans. Alongside Saruman's Uruk-hai, the Dunlendings would wage the Battle of the Hornburg, the very location where their ancestors put Helm Hammerhand under siege, a place where Helm's wraith was rumored to stalk his enemies. After Gandalf's arrival with Erkenbrand and the Rohirrim reinforcements, the men of Dunland would surrender. This defeat is said to have finally put an end to Dunlending aggression in Rohan. However, Saruman would not be done with the servants of Dunland. After his defeat at Isengard at the hands of the Ents, he would eventually be freed of his captivity by Treebeard, and traveling north, he would be overtaken on the road in Dunland by Gandalf, the Hobbits, and others on their way to Rivendell after Sauron's defeat. Little did the heroes realize that Saruman's evil deeds were already in motion and carried out by many ruffians. These ruffians are no doubt made up of a great number of Dunlendings. In the end, roughly 100 of these ruffians would fight against a force of 200 hobbits in the Battle of Bywater, the climactic battle in the Scouring of the Shire. In the end, the hobbits would have a resounding victory, killing 70 ruffians, capturing 12, with the remaining men fleeing. Nothing more is said of the Dunlendings in the days after the War of the Ring, and while it was said they would no longer attack Rohan, there is reason to hope for more than just a mere stalemate. After their defeat at the Battle of Helm's Deep, Erkenbrand says to the captive Dunlendings, "Help now to repair the evil in which you have joined, and afterwards you shall take an oath never again to pass the fords of Isen in arms, nor to march with the enemies of men. And then you shall go free back to your land, for you have been deluded by Saruman. Many of you have got death as the reward of your trust in him. But had you conquered, little better would your wages have been." The men of Dunland were amazed, for Saruman had told them that the men of Rohan were cruel and burned their captives alive. We will never know for certain what became of the Dunlendings in the days of the Fourth Age, but just maybe, there is hope that peace came between Dunland and Rohan, and that old wounds between these ancient houses of middlemen could finally be healed. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom de Bombadil 19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Z and N, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Next time on Nerd of the Rings.